Well, good day. Welcome everyone to Come Let Us Reason Together, both the video channel and the podcast. And I'm excited today to be joined once again by my good friend, Kenneth Samples. Ken has been at the forefront of defending the faith for many years. Worked with Walter Martin, the Bible Answer Man, and he's currently one of the scholars for Reasons to Believe. And I just wanted to say welcome, Ken. I'm glad to have you here, and just wonderful to have this point in time where we can have a discussion on an interesting topic during these days. So why don't you tell me a little bit about this concept of selflessness versus selfishness and how this came about?
Yeah, Lenny, it's really good to see you. You've been a good friend of mine for a long time, and I respect your ministry very much. You do a really good job. One thing that I like about you as an apologist is you realize that philosophy and apologetics are branches of theology, and I appreciate that, especially about you. Well, it's good to be with you. I've been thinking a long time, Lenny, about the idea of what is the Christian worldview say about human beings? What is our anthropology? What is it distinctly about us that aligns with Christianity? And as I have thought about my own spiritual life, as I have read other people like Augustine, Aquinas, Peter Crave, Blaise Pascal, I've come across this idea that I think maybe one of the fundamental links to our fallenness as human beings is this idea of selfishness. I mean, part of my own devotions is I will often go through the 7 deadly sins as they were described by the medieval Christian thinkers: anger, envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth. And I've tried to think, what is the link in all of those? And I suspect that right at the core of our brokenness, our woundedness, if you will, is this idea of selfishness. And of course, it collides with our obligations in life to love God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves. We wrestle with these things. And I think in light of the pandemic, in thinking about people's obligations, I mean, we have in society different responses to this kind of world crisis. Some people are very scared, and of course, I completely understand that. But I think we've seen kind of self arise in maybe people buying up as much toilet paper or many as goods as they can, or maybe the young people thinking YOLO, you only live once.
Go to the beach, right?
go to the beach and have fun on spring break.
Yeah.
And the more I've thought about this, the more I think that I think that Thomas Aquinas was right. He said that he thought one of the fundamental signs of original sin is self-obsession. And I have to tell you, I'm a very serious Christian. I take my faith seriously. It's not just a bunch of ideas to me. I care deeply about living out my life of faith, hope, and love. But I have to say that I wrestle with trying to get my mind off of myself. And I wonder if many of the Christians of the past, people like Augustine, Aquinas, Pascal, if they don't do a great job in reminding us of the struggle that we have to put aside our selfishness and become more selfless people.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. One of the things that I've been doing over the course of, say, the last couple of years is I've kind of come at it from a different perspective. I've tried to better understand what are kind of some of the essential attributes and characteristics of who God is. Mm-hmm. And what's of course, one of the challenges we have is defending the concept of the Trinity. And there's usually with Jehovah's Witnesses or others, there's some resistance to that. But we both know that the Trinity actually solves more problems than it creates. One
Yeah.
of which is the idea that God can be love. How
Yeah.
can God be love if he doesn't have someone to love? As C.S. Lewis say, right? The lover, the beloved, and the love that is between them. And as a triune being, there can be a love relationship between each of the persons in the Godhead. Also, you can have God showing deference. You can have selflessness and sacrifice and things like that as the Son lays down his life, as the Father gives up the Son, all of these pieces. So one of the things that I came to this, and again, I've been thinking about this for a couple of years as well, is that selflessness and love are pretty parallel. Usually love is adequately defined as thinking of another person or putting the other person's needs ahead of your own, which is a fair definition of selflessness. So if God is love, then God is selfless. And that started me ruminating on how over and over again I see in the scriptures our call as Christians is to be selfless. It's not to be selfish. And I think that's fascinating that we can, there's so much there that we can kind of come to from either side, from either God's perfections or from man's fallenness. So
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I've intentionally taken a different tact with my discussions over the last couple of years with Muslims, with Jews, with Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, like you, I have for 3 decades been debating people about the Trinity. And, it usually goes the course: the Bible teaches the Trinity. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. I was on a Facebook discussion with the Jehovah's Witness, and I changed tactics. I said, look, you believe that God is a single solitary being. Jehovah is the only true God, and he created Jesus, and through Jesus created all other things. And I brought her back to that very point you're making here. I said, if Jehovah is a single solitary being and the Son is a creature and the Holy Spirit is an impersonal power, who did Jehovah love in eternity? And, I have to say, Lenny, I've been talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Muslims for many years, and I really thought there was a change, because I asked her, she happened to be a woman, and I said, when you go door to door, do you tell people that Jehovah loves them? And how do you know that Jehovah is love in and of himself? Is he desperate? Does he have to create in order to get love? And I did that. I've done that with 2 Muslim apologists that I debated online. I've also talked to Jews about this idea. And I'm even thinking and working on the idea of writing a book about this, because I think once you start to talk about the issue, does God love me? How can I know? How can love be anchored in God?
yeah,
Because there's this tension, if God is alone, does that make him desperate? Who does he have to love? And I like your contrast very much, and I think that's right. I have difficulty taking attention away from myself, but I notice that when I think about the Trinity, when I reflect on the Trinity, or when I focus my attention on my wife or my children or on other people, it seems that I'm able to move away from, to some extent, that kind of vicious cycle on self. So I appreciate your comments very much, and that's something I think really needs to be
yeah,
discussed in apologetics and theology.
yeah. I completely agree. What now? When we talk about selfishness, I want to be really careful, because some people tend to think selfishness is something as mundane as, oh, you took the last slice of cake, or something of that nature. When you say selfishness, can you expand on that? What do you mean? How do you understand it?
Yeah, I think in a Christian context, I think that we're made in God's image, and I think part of what that means to be made in God's image is that we are lovers and worshipers. That's the way God made us to be. He made us to love him. He made us to worship him. When the fall happens, and however you define the receiving of that sinful nature, I much prefer the Western interpretation in terms of original sin than I do to kind of an Eastern Orthodox perspective, simply because I think it's more biblical and more in accord with my own experience. But I think in our fallen condition, instead of reaching out to God and instead of moving toward God, we are to use the language of Augustine and then later Martin Luther. We're curved in back in upon ourselves, and that this idea is that instead of worshiping God, instead of wanting to give our love and attention to God and others, there's this twisted sense. Curvatus in se is the Latin expression. And again, I wonder if that doesn't have a great deal of explanatory power. Now, obviously, none of us are proud about our sinful condition. We all are grateful for God's grace. But I wonder if the Christian perspective on the fall isn't superior not just to naturalism, but to other worldviews as well, in terms of what they think about human beings. So to use Augustine and Luther, this kind of we're curved in on ourselves in a very unhealthy and unloving way.
That's very interesting. It's especially true, I think, in our 21st century Western culture, America's explicitly being almost hyper individualistic in our approach. It has become, 100 years ago, and I've used this example, one of the reasons why, say, the town alcoholic was shamed, or the young girl who may have conceived out of wedlock, those type of things, wasn't merely that they violated a moral precept, but the community, and most communities, recognized that the entire community well-being rests on each individual contributing something to the whole. And an individual who is an alcoholic now and can't function is not merely not contributing, they're actually drawing resources away from the community. Now, right or wrong as to how they treated those individuals 100 years ago, that's a separate question. I understand the young girls would have to go away and things like that. But there was an understanding that one person's failure could actually endanger the larger, broader community. And we don't really think in terms of community. Actually, COVID-19 is kind of forcing our hand and making us rethink these kinds of ideas, because now it's not what I want to do, whether I want to go out. It's even if I don't get sick, right? Even if you're a 19-year-old kid where your chances of fatality are very low, the fact that you could spread that or cause other people to have to go to the hospital, which then puts too much strain on the medical system, which means that the person who's even suffering a stroke now can't get a bed. All of those are crucial issues. And it's kind of really forcing our hands back to a communal view as opposed to an individualistic view. So how does the message of selfishness versus selflessness survive or thrive beyond, say, the current crisis?
Yeah, well, I think you've articulated it well. I mean, I think whether it is a worldwide pandemic or whether it is something that happens in a family, I think what we recognize is that our selfishness impacts not just ourselves. It impacts other individuals. My relationship with my wife, my relationship with my children, my relationship with other Christian people that I know. I guess I would say this. I think that I think again this kind of reveals something very interesting to me. Peter Kreeft said that he thought that sin was a type of mental illness. And what he meant by that was this, that in our original sin, instead of choosing to have eternal relationships with God, and instead of embracing those things that will give us true happiness, we hold on to things that are temporal, and we sacrifice the eternal for the temporal. I think what's interesting about that whole thing is that selfishness, if selfishness or something like it, this curvatus in se, if that is in fact a characteristic of our fallen condition, it indicates that we insist on having our own way, even when it affects other individuals and other people. And I wonder after this pandemic passes, and I'm hopeful and optimistic that we will move forward and we'll gain an advantage over this natural disaster, if you will. I think that we have to begin thinking about the idea of, look, my selfishness doesn't just impact me, it does impact the entire community. It impacts my family. It impacts my church community. It impacts so many other people. And frankly, that's helpful to me when I realize that, hey, I need to get my focus off myself. Understanding that I may cause problems for other people helps me. And, you know, that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the fall. This self-obsession, Peter Craiff, this idea that maybe mental illness is a type of inherited, original sin is a type of inherited mental illness. I mean, that's very, very provocative for Christians to be thinking that way.
Yeah, that is. That's very interesting. One of the other things, of course, I wanted to touch on was we tend to have a penchant for claiming or looking perhaps at non-believers in the world as selfish, and then the church as, of course, the body of Christ, right? We're doing everything right. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think that there can be a lot of selfishness expressed even within the church. Sometimes Christian people thinking they're doing Christian things. One of the interesting pieces that's come out of this is just a paper that's come out of the University of Copenhagen showing how searches for prayer have gone up dramatically since this pandemic began. And you can pray and seek God, and that sounds great, but if you're praying just to save your skin, if God is nothing more than, you know, a therapeutic deist that is here to save you, then that's actually selfishness writ large. How do you see selfishness perhaps expressed in the church, where we may not even be realizing what we're doing is selfish?
Yeah, Lenny, I'm working on a new book, and one of the chapters is entitled, Why Are So Many Christians So Unlike Christ? And of course, you know, Nietzsche said, if you want me to believe in a Redeemer, why don't you act a little more redeemed? And, you know, some of the new atheists have, you know, tried to point out that Christian people don't always live the kind of lives that encourage people to embrace Christ. I would say this. I think that I think that it is helpful to kind of think about this sinful condition as a severe mercy. That is, as much as I don't like my sinful condition, as much as I don't like being self-obsessed, as much as I disdain the idea that I'm not more altruistic, that I'm not more, you know, agape oriented. I think in one sense, what has been beneficial through this is I see my need for grace. I mean, it has brought me to the point where I realize that, you know, if it is up to me, if I could lose my salvation, I think I surely would. If it all depended upon me, I would lose it all. But I think in some ways, this being in this position of seeing my own brokenness, my own woundedness, it has motivated me to reach out in grace and then to apply that to the church. Lenny, I really think that one of the fundamental characteristics of the Christian life is grace. It is that loving kindness that you talked about with the Trinity. And I think one thing that I'm trying to do is to try to draw attention to my Christian friends that apologetic persuasion and drawing people to Christianity, while it must fundamentally include very careful thinking and the affirmation of Christian truth, it has to be accompanied by a sense of graciousness.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are times in our churches, I think, where we think, well, as long as I'm right, you're wrong. It doesn't really matter what kind of personal characteristics I communicate to you. I'm right. And I think the fact of the matter is that a winsome, caring, gracious person, somebody who exhibits kindness, has a way of really drawing people. And so I wonder if in our own selfishness in the church, if we can't try to encourage people to recognize that, they're caught in the web and they're not going to get out of it apart from the grace of God. But maybe the one fundamental thing that is so distinct from God to us is the point you've made: God's loving kindness. That God is kind to me. He is patient with me. He reaches out to me in my kind of brokenness. And I meet non-Christians all the time. Working at Reasons to Believe, I get to talk to people in math, science fields. Sometimes they think that, me and my colleagues are kind of kooky, that we're Christians, yet we're interested in science. But I like to communicate to them. I mean, if I met Albert Einstein, the first comment out of my mouth would not be, "How long have you been suppressing the truth and unrighteousness?" My first comment would be, "Wow, how did you ever come together to grasp general relativity? How did your ideas in your mind end up corresponding to reality?" I guess what I'm saying, Lenny, is this: that we can learn a lot from non-Christians, and sometimes they have virtues and values that can improve our state as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's been interesting to me to use the barometer of selfishness versus selflessness as a yardstick against perhaps actions that I'm contemplating. So, I mean, there was a craze several years ago where people would wear the WWJD bracelets. If you remember, the kind of Charles Sheldon's book spawned this whole idea in his steps. But what I found is it's actually a little bit more concrete when you start to ask, is the action that I'm taking selfish or selfless? And you have to weigh some variables in there. It's not selfish to say, put your oxygen mask on first before helping another. That's what God would have you do. Matter of fact, when Martin Luther wrote about the bubonic plague that was ravaging his town, he made the point that we're not to leave our neighbor lying in a ditch, but you're not to jump off the pinnacle of the temple and tempt God either. We were given proper reason, and we understand how things work to some extent, and so we're supposed to use all of those pieces together. So selfish versus selflessness becomes an interesting barometer, and I found this to be really useful even in practical things that maybe the church hasn't always been very clear on. So one of the areas that I've looked into this, and one of the areas I think that the church struggles, especially in 21st century culture, is the whole milieu of sexuality and how we understand sex. Traditionally, church has taught that, it's good, created by God in marriage. Outside of marriage, it's bad. And this good bad dichotomy, some people have found it wanting, others have found it intimidating. And I've never been that comfortable with it because it feels like there's some kind of a shift there. But if we reposition the question instead of good bad, and if we say, is your engagement with another person selfish or selfless, that changes the equation completely, because selfless physical engagement, if you understand physical engagement as something that touches another person in their inner being, then the only way you're going to be selfless in that is if you've already committed yourself to that person for their lives. For most of humanity, right, it meant the risk of creating a child, which is how you defined marriage at that point. So if you're not willing to be selfless enough to say, I will be here for the possibility of children, I will be here for the emotional support of you, then you're being selfish. And isn't that what sex outside of wedlock is? Matter of fact, the ultimate form of selfish sex is rape. That's exactly what it is. And this now starts to answer a whole lot of things about pornography, about some of these other issues, even transgenderism and certain questions that we have on that. But isn't it interesting, by changing the dialogue, by changing the perspective, we don't get it's bad until it's good, which a lot of people, oh, I'm just eating forbidden fruit. It's selfish versus selfless, and that is consistent. But it just, the thing that makes it selfless is your ability to commit to another person. So what do you think on issues like that?
No, I think that's very provocative. I mean, in one sense, I think love asks, what can I do for you? Lust asks, what can you do for me?
Right.
And what's interesting, Lenny, in light of the media discussion of sexuality, the difficulties that people have in terms of pornography, I think when it comes to a sense of satisfaction, Aristotle talked about the idea of eudaimonia. He used the word, it conveys happiness, but it's deeper than that, a deep sense of fulfillment. What's interesting is when you are interested in the welfare of other people, when you are looking out for the welfare of other individuals, the irony of it is that often that leads to satisfaction within you.
Right.
Whereas the temptation is to think, no, I need to get. I don't want to give too much. I want to get, and the getting will satisfy me. But I think in our own experiences in our life and in a biblical context, we see that being concerned about the welfare, that very commitment, being committed to one particular person, brings this deep sense of my relationships have meaning. They have purpose. There is an endurance to them. And I think that's the irony. The irony is you think by giving you're not going to get, but really by giving you end up getting.
Yeah.
And that's again, I think, being twisted. We have that twisted angle that I, me, mine. It has to be me. I have to put myself first. But if we follow Christian virtues, if we strive for them, one of the great things is that the Lord's grace does give us fulfillment in life.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that we see this in secular world. I think Ross Douthat, I believe, wrote a book called The Second Mountain, where he talks about many successful CEOs and business individuals who conquered their goal, and they were still left unfulfilled. And his premise of that book was they had to either reinvent themselves to seek some kind of goal that was service oriented, that put others ahead of themselves in order to truly feel fulfilled, or they would kind of, turn a la Howard Hughes or something to that effect.
Yeah.
So it's part of who we are. It's part of our nature, and it's exactly what Jesus said. He said, whoever would be greatest will be the least, and servant of all. He washed his disciples' feet. He modeled this selflessness, and that wasn't simply a one-time act. It was done in almost a ritualistic way to communicate a lesson. Usually, a rabbi would teach his disciples in order to get a lesson to go. But if he acted it out, then it's pretty serious. It's something he wants you to remember. And I think Jesus did this over and over again. The most famous, of course, being the Good Samaritan parable, which has it replete through there. But over and over again, this is how I started coming back to this idea of selflessness, is the more I analyze these things, the more I start to see even 1 Corinthians 7, your body is not your own. Over and over again, it's selfless versus selfish. And that seems to be the primary message that God is trying to get across to us, because you're right. People don't even think about it, right? Even there are so many worship songs that are from the individual perspective. You did this for me. I'm now saved. It's what I call worship that needs ophthalmology because you have eye trouble. So I think this is a timely message, and it's an interesting point, given our circumstances, to bring it up. So where do you see are examples maybe that we can leverage from either popular society, where we're seeing folks do selfless things for the betterment of humanity, or perhaps also in the church? What are some good examples of selflessness that we can hold up as a paradigm for the average churchgoer?
Yeah, I think is interesting. I wrote a blog article kind of looking at the pandemic. One of the points I make in that brief article, Lenny, is that Christians have faced these kinds of things before. There were diseases that reached into the Roman world, the medieval world, Luther, the bubonic plague, 19th century Europe. What I think is very interesting is, though, that when Christians responded selflessly, when they developed hospice care, when they founded orphanages, when they shared their food with Christians and non-Christians, and of course, this is before modern science. This is before modern medicine. They were exposing themselves. I think that this actually led to an expansion of Christianity. I mean, when people started seeing that these Christian people are willing to give even when it hurts, it transformed the minds of many people. Many people began to see, wow, these Christians have a different worldview. They have a different value system. I wonder if we even after the pandemic, I had a pastor contact me on Facebook. He is living in Uganda, and he said to me that his family is held up in a garage just trying to quarantine, and they may be kicked out of there. The pastor, the financial benefits have kind of gone down the tubes. And I began thinking to myself, Lenny, that, this is a difficult time that my country is facing. But there are, in the third world, these kind of events are regular. These kinds of challenges, Ebola, all of these kinds of issues, persecution. I wonder if after this passes, if we can't look out and say, what is it like to live in the third world? What is it like for other people to live in these kind of contexts? And it's kind of, it's kind of led me to think that again, that selfish idea, I don't like it if, well, my 401k drops to a 211k.
Yeah.
I don't like it if I can't go out and speak, or,
Right.
I have these kinds of tensions, and it's not in any way to diminish the difficult struggles that people have in our world. But I do wonder, Lenny, if we can't begin to think about people who on a regular basis, their life is in turmoil.
Yeah.
Uh, they don't have the kind of securities that we have. And I think, and yet this pastor had a very robust, I mean, he was upbeat. He was quoting scripture to me. He was the one going through this dire time. And I thought, wow, um, I hope I don't lose that when things turn around and everything is better. So I wonder if we cannot communicate to Christians in the pews that, whatever situation you have, there is a lot of people having a whole lot more difficult time, and maybe we can reach out to them.
That's so true. And to your point, I think Rodney Stark agrees with you in his book. He makes a very big deal about, of course, the plague of Cyprian,
Yeah.
and how much that made a difference. He really credits the rapid expansion of Christianity to that for two reasons. He says, first of all, the pagan priests abandoned their posts. There was always a transactional nature to Roman worship. I provide these sacrifices and I do these deeds for the gods, and the gods should look upon me with favor and they should give me something in return. The idea of selfless service just didn't exist in the religio of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Also, you had people in Rome when the plague hit, they would leave their family members. I mean, oh, you're sick, you're going to have to fend for yourself. I'm going so I don't catch it. And the Christians were running the other direction. They were running in and taking care of these people. Now, two side benefits came of this. The first is when you're living in an enchanted world like that, to borrow Charles Taylor's term, where you see your health and the responses to struggle as how the gods interpret things.
Yeah.
They noticed all the Christians were doing so much better. More of them survived, more of them thrived after a pandemic than the Romans did. Why was that? Well, it was pretty easy. The Christians were caring for their sick. So yeah, more of them got better. But the slaves, the women, those who were oppressed saw this as very attractive. And the people, of course, were also the second piece that Stark argues is that sometimes people like the patriarch of the household may have passed away, and now there's nothing that would inhibit you from perhaps converting to Christianity. We know the whole thing was so upsetting because Julian, the emperor of Rome, who apostatized and wanted to bring back the old gods, complained, why aren't you guys taking care of these people like these Christians are? Yeah. And he couldn't even get his folks to because it just wasn't part of their worldview. But this is something that Christianity has always done. And that's one of the pieces that we may not all do it, but God, it reminds me, echoes of Esther. If not you, God will use someone else, but who knows whether he put you in this time for this purpose at this point. And I see that over and over. That seems to be how the body of Christ works. We're not all perfect, but God will use whom God will use to get his program accomplished.
Yeah, I've recently been thinking about those very ideas. And I mean, I look at the Salvation Army and I think, I immediately think, well, I differ with their theological ideas here, and here. Or I look at the Seventh-day Adventists and I say, well, here's where I would differ with them doctrinally. But, I give my money to the Salvation Army because I know they help people. My wife works at an Adventist hospital. I see that their Christian values have impacted their idea of wanting to make people whole. Yeah. And for people like you and I who love ideas, who, eat, drink, and sleep ideas, who are consumed with ideas, I think it's powerful. It's a powerful thing to realize that persuasion, apologetic persuasion, comes both in ideas and in actions,
Yes.
values, and care. So I'm hoping I can learn some things. I mean, for me, pain and suffering and evil, they are a severe mercy. They're severe. They hurt. It's painful. It's when I was in a hospital with half a dozen brain lesions, boy, I was not a happy camper. I was in
Yeah.
pain. I was in difficulty. But it was a mercy because I began to see other people who were sick, who had deep faith, and it tethered me again to God, that I need to be reminded that I'm not the master of my own fate. I'm not in ultimate control. I need to be reminded of that necessary connection to the Lord. And so this is a powerful point. God has good reasons for allowing evil, pain, and suffering. There are good
Yeah.
things he brings out of it.
Yeah, I agree. Dallas Willard had a great quote. He said, "It's only in the heat of pain and suffering, both mental and physical, that real human character is forged. One does not develop courage without facing danger, patience without trials, wisdom without heart and brain racking puzzles, endurance without suffering, or temperance and honesty without temptations. These are the very things we treasure most about people." And
Well,
then he goes on to say, ask yourself if you would be willing to be devoid of all these virtues. If your answer is no, then don't scorn the means of obtaining them. I think that's
well,
amazing.
that's
So,
great. Yeah, I mean, I've been writing a new book and it's painful. And, I think, is it worth it to do this? But, out of those struggles, I am able to refine my thinking. I'm able to communicate something meaningful and purposeful. And, God again has good reasons to build our character, to sharpen our mind, to help us develop wisdom. Those are things we need to communicate during this time where
yeah,
people are hurting and people are afraid.
yeah, I completely agree. Any other thoughts that you would have on the concept of selfishness, Ken, that you'd want to express?
Yeah, I'd like to do it in the context of the pandemic. Pascal has a quote from the Pensées where he says that maybe the fundamental problem with human beings is that we cannot be alone in our room by ourselves.
Hmm.
And, now we're sheltered in. Now we're in a position where we find ourselves alone. I think what Pascal is getting at is, the human heart is troubled.
Yeah.
And when you start to look in and you start to examine your own motivations, and when you start looking at who you are and where you are, you touch on these kind of lonely elements. I think in some respects, maybe this is a very good thing, because maybe the Lord will use this pandemic as a way for us to maybe think deeper about life, that
Mm.
maybe the wonderful technology and the great prosperity that we have in the West, maybe it's not enough. Maybe there are deeper things in order to give us real value and purpose. And
Yeah.
and again, there's that element that we're looking for happiness, but if we are concerned with the welfare of others, we turn around and we have this tremendous sense of fulfillment. And that's a powerful irony.
Oh, yeah, I so agree with that. I think one of the scariest verses in scripture is in Genesis chapter 11 when they build the Tower of Babel, and God says, and nothing they purpose in their hearts will now be withheld from them. That'd be almost the worst curse I could imagine. You think being online all day playing video games in your closet is the way to live? Yeah, I'll give you that. It's just
Yeah.
as the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, right? You want meat? I'll give you meat. I'll give you meat till it's coming out of your nostrils. I'll give you meat.
Yeah.
So So we do tend to think that we know what's best for us until we have it and find out that it is lacking. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lenny. I look forward to seeing you face to face here sometime in the future, and but it's certainly nice to go on screen and talk to you
Yes.
about ideas that are important. And I know I want to tell people how much I value what you do. You
Oh,
are
thank you.
a sharp thinker, but you're also a person who cares very much about living the Christian life, commitment to your family. So, I appreciate you. I appreciate the way you conduct yourself. So, thank you for having me on. It's a privilege.
Well, thank you so much, Ken, for taking some time out and joining me today. I appreciate that as well. I would love to see your book length treatment on this to see if you're going to. I don't want to promise anything too soon because I know that you're in the midst of another writing project. So, but it fascinates me, and I think there's something here because I think people are starting to realize the selfishness of our culture as it becomes more and more blatant in our society. There's a greater level of frustration and, as you say, missing value that people just recognize. It's just not part of who we are. So I think it's an important message. I'm so glad you reached out. And all of you at Reasons to Believe have always been a big blessing. I so appreciate Hugh Ross and the team. I appreciate all that you've done and how much you've bolstered the faith for so many over the years. So it's been a true blessing talking with you.
All right. Take good care. Your family, take good care.
Thank you, my friend. We will, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.